heard really a radio program recently, and there was a discussion of the fact that even people who were not people of faith, actually, I don't know exactly how you would put what the person was trying to say, he was really talking about the importance of the Bible and how important it was. And he was talking about how even people of faith, people who are not people of faith, actually benefit from it. And it really got me to thinking, and I've been thinking about this for a while, and I decided that for the lesson this evening, what we're going to do is we're going to set down a few things that just kind of come to your mind as you're thinking about things that the Scriptures provide for man, whether they understand it or whether they don't. It's there. One of the things that makes it where this lesson becomes rather important is we look at our country, for example, in which we live. And we've had a lot of problems over the last few years that really are directly related to these things. What we need to understand is that if you want a successful society, and it's going to function in a successful way, there's some guidelines that are there, and I put them to be God's guidelines, because if you believe the Bible to be the inspired Word of God, then in fact these words that we're going to be reading are in fact His words. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how do you have a successful society. People sometimes talk about things and they don't realize that what they actually are doing is giving credit to the inspired Word. They don't realize that, but that's actually what's happening. Let's kind of think about this just a little bit and realize some of these things. You know, if you're going to have a successful society, and you can argue whatever you please, but there has to be a belief in God, and there has to be a recognition that all moral principles are dependent upon that belief in God. Because here's the problem that you have. If you do not believe in God, and if the majority of the people that surround you don't believe in God, then there will be no moral principles guiding their lives. They'll do whatever they please. Because there's nothing to, as we might say, rein them in. The Bible actually says that. In the first 4 verses of Psalms 53, the first verse you recognize, it's actually repeated twice here and in Psalms 14. He said, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." Now, if you stop and think about that, I know that sometimes we use the word fool as kind of a curse word, as kind of just an intended insult of someone. That's the way the word is sometimes used. But that's really not the way that it's used from a scriptural perspective. As it's used in the Word of God, it actually is a word that simply means that here's a person who is devoid of understanding. That's what it actually means. That here's a person who he's foolish. He doesn't act in a way that is rational. And that's what the word actually has in mind. The fool has said in his heart there is no God simply means that you really have to ignore the facts to believe that, and you are creating a bad situation when you state that belief, because automatically when you say that there is no God, you are also saying there is no absolute standard of moral behavior. That means that we establish the standard. And that means that if you live in a country filled with people who are in fact cannibals and they eat other people, then that would be moral in that society because they dictate it to be so. The only thing that makes something moral is society if God is taken out of the picture. And that's why he says, and by the way, I'm not just commenting here because I want you to read the rest of what he said. If you read the rest of what he said, you understand that's exactly what he's telling you. He said the person who says there is no God needs to recognize when he makes that statement, he removes moral responsibility from everyone and everyone does as they please. You don't believe that? Let me read the rest of what he said. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Corrupt are they, and have done abominable iniquity. There is none that doeth good. God looketh down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there are any that did understand, that did seek God. Every one of them has gone back. They're altogether become filthy. Why? Because they're not seeking God. There's none that doeth good, no, not one. You're not capable of that without God. Have the workers of iniquity no knowledge? Who eat up my people as they eat bread? They have not called upon God. Now that's really the point. Now people can say whatever they want. But the only thing that makes our nation a tolerable place to live is the majority of the people in time past have believed that God exists and they have a moral responsibility to Him. And as we've seen that belief in God began to become less prevalent, what have you seen? What do you see? In our nation or any other nation that's following that course of action. What do you see? Do you see that we're getting to be better and better morally? And that our moral standard is rising all the time? Is that what you see? No, you don't see that at all. What you see is that as the disbelief in God and disrespect for God's will and saying it's useless and it's foolish, and now people even making fun of you if you even have the audacity to say that you believe there's a God, that what you see is the moral behavior go down, down, down. Now that's exactly what Psalms 53 says. Exactly. So what happens when the moral standard goes down, down, down? You think a lack of morality might have had anything to do that you had cities that were burned to the ground, stores that were broken in, people that were killed, merchandise that was stolen? You think it had anything to do with it that you had a lot of immoral people? You reckon that might be the case? So what you need to realize and understand is that all these people who say, oh, the Bible, it's just kind of a bit of mythology and has nothing to do with us. Read that passage very carefully. When you say there's no God, then basically you are by that statement telling every person living the only moral standard that you have to live by is the one that you accept. And whatever your standard is, then that's what you're going to live by. And that's not a good thing. And a society with that type of a basis is simply not going to be very successful. Second point. If you're going to talk about a successful society, every successful society in existence understands that the nuclear family, now that's pretty well, and that's something that you see under attack today. I mean, you see it all the time where people just really outwardly oppose this. I see school systems in our country that are giving open positions of saying that we want to try to destroy the nuclear family. Why? Because basically they're saying because that produces belief in God, and that's a detriment to our society, so we don't want it. But what you realize is if you look round about and you see that the nuclear family is ignored and thrown out, the more that's done, the more problems we have. Well, what is a nuclear family? Well, God defined it. Man leaves his father and mother and cleaves his wife, and they shall be one flesh. That's a nuclear family. And they stay bound to each other as long as they're both living. That's what a nuclear family is as God designed it. Now, let's look at what that does for us. Let's look at how that translates into society, how our societies become better by the nuclear family. In the book of Proverbs, chapter 1, verse 7 through 9, he says this. It's kind of interesting to notice the connection. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. That goes up to point 1 that we just made. But fools despise wisdom and instruction. In other words, foolish people don't want God to tell them what to do. And you know what he then says? Where does most of that instruction from God come from? Where does it start? My son, hear the instruction of thy father. Forsake not the law of thy mother. For they shall be an ornament of grace unto thy head and chains about thy neck. You just look around you and you just, well, if you want a real education about the problems in our country, just go ask somebody to teach you school okay, if you have problem students, are they generally from parents where both the mother and the father, the natural parents, are in that home? Is that kind of where the problems usually are instigated? And they're going to tell you no. That's not really the most of the problem. Most of the problem comes because of a lot of other factors that factor in. And what we're doing is we're just failing to recognize how important mothers and fathers are. I mean, you stop and think about it. If you have children who are not going to school until they're 5 years old, that would mean if you took fathers and mothers out of the picture, then exactly where do they get their instruction? Exactly who would guide them? Just think about it. Just consider it. Our country, for all the efforts to destroy the nuclear family that's taking place, is dependent upon the nuclear family for the stability of our society, and so is every other society. And the people need to realize it. God said it, and we ought to understand that He is the one with much more knowledge than man, which we'll get back to a bit later. And then there's something else that comes into play. A belief that discipline is necessary to stability. Can you have stability in a society with no discipline? Just think about that. I know that we don't like laws. Laws are aggravating. Rules and regulations, they get aggravating. But at the same time, we have to also understand that they're kind of necessary. There has to be laws. I mean, if you think of the simplest thing, because almost everyone here drives, just think of the simple thing. What if where we drove on the road was at our discretion, right hand or left hand? Didn't make any difference. Do you think that'd be a good idea? So then if I go out and I say, well, I ought to be able to drive on the left-hand side if I want to, so I just take off down the northbound lane going southbound, what do you think the result of that's going to be? Do you think that there needs to be someone with the ability to discipline me for that? Well, if he didn't, then what would happen? If you look at a home and you look at children who go to school and they give teachers all kinds of problems, in most cases, if you look back, they gave the parents all kinds of problems too. We just don't teach discipline, and that's the problem. And we have to understand that discipline is something that if you don't have it, then you have a very serious problem that eventually is going to rise to a position and a limit that is going to create problems that are going to be just very, very difficult. Now, if you notice what God said, now I'm just looking at what God said. If you want to have a good society, God's kind of the guideline. He said, the rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself bringeth his mother to shame. When the wicked are multiplied, and he's talking now of society in general, transgression increaseth, but the righteous shall see their fall. Correct thy son, and he shall give thee rest. Yea, he shall give delight unto thy soul. Now you just think about it. When you start thinking about discipline, how important it is, I can still remember when Dr. Spock had his famous book, and Dr. Benjamin Spock, and he comes out and says we should never discipline a child. He writes this book. Well, after a few years, I think about 12, a lot of people had experimented with his idea, his philosophy, no discipline of children. Just let them do whatever they please. And evidently he must have heard and seen how disastrous that was, because he rewrote his book and said, we need some discipline. Anybody in their right mind knows that that's true. God tells us it's so. We read this morning in Ecclesiastes chapter 8 in society in general. If you don't have discipline, you have to stop and think about that. And just think about what would happen if you had no disciplined society, if you didn't have a police force. I mean, all this talk about police force in our country, just look at places where they've said, we're going to defund them. We're not going to have one. We're just going to... They tried that in Portland, Oregon. And they corded off a place and made it this perfect paradise, no policemen allowed. And everybody was just praising it and singing its praises until somebody got murdered. And then in a few days it all disappeared because they realized they can't do that. It's not possible. You can't just allow people to do whatever they please. God knew that. And God said in that passage we read this morning there, in Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and verse 11, because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the hearts of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. Do you want to live in a society with no police force? You might think about that a little bit. Well, who gave you that information to begin with? God. God said it's not a good idea. God said you will not have an orderly society unless there is discipline within that society. And we need to pay some attention to it. In Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 11, it's really interesting what God said. And he spoke something that most of us would acknowledge as being true. Now, no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous. I don't care if you're getting a speeding ticket, if you get arrested for trespassing, or if you get a spanking as a child. Whatever type of discipline comes along is usually not a very pleasant experience. I mean, it's kind of the nature of discipline, you know. And God said, no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby. Now think about it. You just think of God's guidelines for a successful society. And what he said was, discipline is necessary. Not pleasant, but necessary. It is something that must be there, or you will not have that fruit of righteousness that he speaks of, that we would acknowledge to be what an orderly society is all about. And then you stop and think about this. Respect for life. Respect for life is very, very important. And not just the abortion question, although that plays a part in it, but there are a lot of other things as well. God wanted us to understand when Noah got off the ark and God's giving some instruction to Noah and his sons, kind of reiterating what he had said to Adam and Eve, because now he's restarted the earth. He's hit the restart button, gone back to 8 people again. And he said in verse 6, one of the principles, or rather in verse 5, one of the principles that you need to understand is this. Surely your blood of your lives will I require, at the hand of every beast will I require it, at the hand of man, at the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. Why? For in the image of God made he man. Now, he's telling you something you need to pay attention to. And what he's saying is that life is extremely important. Now, Jeremiah makes the point that life is important, even the most vulnerable. Now, what's that mean? Well, just think a moment about it. There was a movie made about Cambodia. It was called The Killing Fields. And I have no idea how many people died there. Numbers I've seen were like in the 2 to 3 million. They were just wiped out by the government because of their convenience, pretty much. Powerful people killed people because they could, and because they were poor, and because they had no way of defending themselves. One of the things about our society that's always been noteworthy over the years is we've tried to not allow that to happen up until the last year, and all of a sudden we've gotten kind of crazy about it, and we've allowed it to happen. But we've been protective of people who are always kind of defenseless. Well, if you go back to the 22nd chapter of the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah is talking about what happened to Judah and why God saw fit to make them go into captivity and to destroy their nation. And here's what he said. Thus saith the Lord, execute ye judgment and righteousness, and deliver the spoil out of the hand of the oppressor, and do no wrong. Do no violence to the stranger, the fatherless, nor the widow. And then he said this statement, neither shed innocent blood in this place. Now, that's a principle that's very important. Very important. And when you think about the subject of abortion, all of a sudden, the only decision you have to really make is this. The only decision that has anything to do with reality is you decide. You have to make a decision. Is that, I don't even know how to say it without saying it, is that a living human being or not? That's it. A baby that's not been born, is it a human being? Well, it is. Absolutely no question that it is. You don't believe that? Look at the state statutes in most states, including ours. If a woman is killed in a traffic accident, even if she's not met the criteria of some of these laws that you detect a heartbeat, if she's killed in a traffic accident and she's discovered to be pregnant at the time, then the person who kills her is charged with 2 murders. Even our state law recognizes that, and we understand that, and we know that. That is an unborn child. I mean, even the drug manufacturers understand that, because in their disclaimers about their drug, their warnings, they always tell you it might be harmful to the life of an unborn child. And so you're talking about a person. God had already told you that. That's not surprising. God had already told us that that was so. In the 21st chapter of the book of Exodus, God gave some instruction. He said, if men strive and hurt a woman with child. Now understand, he's saying that that is a human being within that woman's body. So that her fruit depart from her, and yet no mischief follow, which seems to say that she had an early birth and nothing happened beyond that, then he'd be punished as the woman's husband will lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judge has determined. And if any mischief follow, then thou shalt give life for life. Whose life? Some say, oh, that's just the life of the mother. Well, he's already told you that that is a woman with child. When you say with child, does that mean a life or not? Seems to me like it means a life. And therefore, if any mischief follow, then thou shalt give life for life. So he could be prosecuted for that. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. A lot of people quote that as if it's a general instruction. It's actually an instruction about this specific instance. So you stop and think about it. You're going to have a society that is an orderly society and a successful society. Are you going to respect human life? You do realize that in several nations in Europe at the present time, you've also taken that the other end of life. In several European nations now, you have boards that convene that discuss the future of people in poor health to say, is their life worth effort or is it not? If we decide it's not, 2 courses can be taken. We can allow them to die or we can euthanize them. One of the two. Either one. Now, is that right? Is that a respect for human life? My belief is that God defines exactly how life can be taken. And He is the one that controls life, and we don't. And when we start looking at an innocent person and innocent blood that we're shedding, then we're pretty treading on some dangerous ground. I've thought for a long time that killing a little over 200 million babies in the last 40 years might come back to haunt us because it's changed our attitude about life, and it has. And now we have people who have a much different attitude because we've paid no attention to what God said. And God said that we need to respect human life, even those who are vulnerable, even more so those who are vulnerable, and certainly, I don't know of a child, of a human life more vulnerable than a life within a mother's womb that's sitting there with a mother making up the mind if they want that child to live or not. That's about as vulnerable as it can get. And so we're talking about something that God has stated, and we need to realize it. We need to understand it. And I'll tell you something else that's a problem. You know, We hear all this talk today about welfare reform and exactly how we ought to affect that. Well, let's kind of look at what the Bible has to say about the subject. Here's the truth. God says in a successful society that you have to have an understanding that we have a personal responsibility for our welfare. Who's responsible for my welfare? Are you? Should I be able to tell you, hand me a check because I need money? If that would be the truth, then a person who robs a convenience store, there's nothing wrong with that, because actually all he needs money to buy his drugs or whatever, so he demands that the person who owns the store or works at the store give it to him. Same principle. He just doesn't accept personal responsibility. So we need to look at what God said. What did God say? You know, when we get all caught up in the political parties and what they might say and what's the politically advantage there can be, let's just ignore all that. And let's look back to what God said will make an orderly society. Let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands, the thing which is good, that he may have to give to him that needeth. And if you look beyond that, maybe the clearest statement that has ever been made, the Apostle Paul stated, 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 10. For even when we were with you, this we commanded you, that if any would not work, neither should he eat. For we hear that there are some which walk among you disorderly, working not at all, but are busybodies. Now them that are such, we command and exhort by our Lord Jesus Christ, that with quietness they work and eat their own bread. That is, they have a personal responsibility for their welfare, and others do not. Now in 1 Timothy chapter 5, Timothy said this. It's a pretty clear statement too, in verse 8. If any provide not for his own, and especially for those of his own house, he had denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. And that's what God said. And listen to all this talk that men spout. We need to pay a little attention to it and go back and see, what did God say will make an orderly society? Everybody kind of accepting personal responsibility, taking care of themselves and doing what they can to provide them themselves. Now, if folks can't, that's a different story. What people need to realize is this. Even in the Old Testament, you read the book of Ruth and you get a good picture of it. Even in the Old Testament, provision was made for people who were down on their luck, if you use those words. It was there. But it was a much different situation. It didn't say just give it to you. He said, okay, what we're going to do, we're going to go around and gather the crop out of the field, but we're going to leave some in the corners. So you have to do something to get it. It's kind of like Franklin Roosevelt when he had those public works things where they dig a ditch one way and fill it up the next. It was really welfare, but it was actually something you had to work to get. It taught a lesson. And it's something that people need to realize and understand. We also need to realize that the Bible does speak of respect for property rights. And that one of the things that I hear now that just really bothers me is people always talking about, well, you know, people got a lot, well, just take it away from them and give them people that don't. Well, think about it. Just give that some consideration. You think that make for an orderly society? Because after all, who decides who's got a lot and who doesn't? And when it comes down to it, when you get to that point, exactly what are you going to outlaw? I mean, I hear people talk about this all the time, how that we ought to just do away with certain crimes because, after all, they're just property crimes. I mean, nowadays, I don't know if you watch the news at all, but in Los Angeles at the present time, if you're shoplifting and you don't steal more than $1,000 worth, then it's really not a crime. It's simply writing a ticket like a speeding ticket. A lot of people don't know that. You think that's what God wants? You think God thinks that's a good thing? That, I'm going to tell you something. If that were true, I could make a lot more money than I make now, I can tell you. I could steal $1,000 a day. That's $7,000 a week. And times the 52, I don't know, my math's not too good, but that looks like that'd get me up to almost $400,000 a year, and I never actually was guilty of a crime, just a minor infraction. You think that's what God wanted? You know what God said? God said, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. In other words, you have property rights. It belongs to you. I didn't put it in here, thought about it, but even in the case of Ananias and Sapphira, you remember, what did Peter say to Ananias? He said, whilst it was thine own, you had power over it. It was yours. You decided. So you stop and think about that. Can a society be a successful society that has no property rights? Where somebody could just walk over to your house, kick down the door, and tell you to get out because I'm going to live here? You say that can't happen? It has happened. It became a major problem when Portland had their issues back last summer. They finally kind of got it dealt with. People just decided, okay, we'll just take this to the final equation. I'm just going to go say, get out. This belongs to me. It doesn't belong to you. And you stop and you think about that, and you wonder, can a society like that continue? And, of course, the answer to that would be no. There has to be respect for civil authorities. God made clear in Romans 13 that we can't, somebody's in authority over us, they're in a pretty tough spot sometimes. One of the things that I think about a lot is people get all upset because of what folks do, and they don't realize sometimes that what they do and what they think are two different things because they have a job that requires certain things of them. I have a feeling that sometimes in a small community where everybody knows everybody, deputy sheriffs probably deliver a lot of papers that they'd rather not. They may not even agree with, but it's their job. It's civil authorities at work. And so God kind of says that we kind of throw out the emotional response. We can't think of the emotion. We have to think of the principle. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God, and the powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. They that resist shall receive to themselves damnation, for rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. And if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger, to execute wrath upon them that doeth evil. Wherefore you must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. And, taxes are kind of a sore spot sometimes. You even have people who go around saying that, the government has no right to collect taxes and all. They're wrong. Even God, through His Son, Jesus Christ, when questioned about that subject, said that famous line in this passage, look on that coin, see whose inscription's on it. And He said it's Caesar's. And He said, well, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, God the things that are God's. Those are necessary to an orderly society. Last point I want to make is this, and I don't know, I've got something on there I don't need, but anyway. The last point I want to make is this. We have talked a lot in the last few years, and I know people get tired of hearing it because they say, it's just really not a problem. But it really is a problem. Is what we've referred to as secular humanism, which simply means there are a large group of people who believe that since there is no God, life was an accident, human beings are just the highest form of accident yet to occur, and so we're kind of the pinnacle of knowledge, and if we don't do it, no one will. And you have that kind of described in Psalms 20, beginning in verse 6. Now know I that the Lord saveth His anointed. He will hear from His holy heaven with the saving strength of His right hand. Now think about what He then says. Some trust in chariots. And He's talking about warfare, but you can apply it to anything. Some trust in chariots and some in horses. But we will remember the name of the Lord our God. In other words, when it comes down to it, back to the first point we made, there has to be a belief in God. And if you don't have that belief in God, who ends up being the highest acumen in existence? Human beings. I hope not. I mean, you think about it. You look at the human beings that are supposed to be smart, intelligent people and look at the decisions and the statements they make and the actions they take. And I hope not. You know, when you look at this passage, what he's telling you is we have to have an understanding we human beings have limits. We can do so much. We can't do some things. We can't affect them. We can't change them. Nothing we can do about it. But who can? From His holy heaven, with the saving strength of His right hand, is God. In verse 8 of this passage, he says, they are brought down and fallen. Talking about those who trust in chariots and horses, the secular humanists. But we are risen. Do you believe that a successful society can exist based upon the premise of secular humanism that human beings are so intelligent that they can successfully guide all their activities? You believe that? I don't believe it for a minute. And I think if you take God out of the equation and the morality that proceeds because God exists, that you have a real problem. He said, save, Lord. Let the King, talking about God, hear us when we call. I thought that this kind of worth our while. Because I think sometimes we get snowballed. If we're not careful, we let people convince us that, hey, you know what? This idea of God, I mean, who's ever seen God? Nobody. So He doesn't exist. And so we just need to move on and understand that we're here from some form of an accidental situation, and we're kind of at the top of the accidental heap, and so it's kind of in our hands. Once you buy that, you can never have a successful society. It'll be a mess. That's just the truth. And we need to understand it. And you say, well, why preach that? Because here's the facts. I've been told over and over and over and over when people don't want to hear what I've got to say that you can't mix political questions and moral questions. That's just plain foolishness. Of course you can. Things that are moral questions sometimes are also political questions, and political questions are sometimes also moral questions. Because after all, it's not what man might say, because man doesn't define the terms, God does. And unless we understand that, we can't have a successful society. I mean, you just think about that. On the day of Pentecost, when Peter said, repent and be baptized for remission of sins, I know that there were people who said, so what? You know, that's just dumb. But is it? Think about it. God has the right to instruct. And we have the right to make a decision to either follow the instruction or not. But unless we do, to some degree, we're going to suffer. And our society is going to suffer. You look at ours and you just be honest with yourself and you ask yourself the question, has it been beneficial because we took God out of schools, we took God out of everything, we don't want God to ever be mentioned? You think that's really helped us and we've really become better because of it? Just think about that. And I think the answer you give, no, hasn't worked out too well. Just give that some thought and think about it together. We stand as we sing.